Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Professor Norman Wirzba. Norman is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology at Duke University. I've known of Norman's work for many years, and I was excited to finally get to have an opportunity to sit down with him at some length. This episode's a little bit longer than our normal unabridged episodes, and we're pleased to get to share with you that full conversation here in this particular episode. We'd had Norman as a guest on one of our live shows that we did here recently up in Kansas City, up and out in Kansas City, but that didn't give us quite enough time to discuss all the things I wanted to discuss, and so grateful for this particular conversation. One of the things that you'll hear that's so, I think, helpful and especially provocative about Norman's work is that he grew up as a farm boy on a farm out in Southern Alberta. There, he said, with the Rocky Mountains on his western horizon, which is a picturesque picture to imagine. And that in time, what he discovered out of his love of philosophy is a way to not merely incorporate his childhood experiences as being raised on a farm, but actually to enrich deeply both his agrarian vision and his philosophy by letting those two disciplines and practices inform one another. It's just a really rich conversation, provocative of a lot of thought, a lot of consideration, and some ways that we might see the beauty and the interdependence in our lives in very compelling, provocative, and helpful ways. Here's Norman Wirzba. Enjoy. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. There is, as you may have noticed, no shortage of content in the world. Opinions endless, outrage plentiful. Deep wisdom and thoughtful perspective slightly harder to come by. That's part of why we created the NSC Notebook. It's our weekly email from the world of No Small Endeavor with reflections on a good life, behind-the-scenes insight into our interviews, and quotes that stuck with me long after those conversations ended. You'll also get a curated list of what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, books, movies, music, and other things I think are actually worth your time. It comes to your inbox every Tuesday, completely free. So if you'd like one less thing to doom scroll and one more thing to actually enjoy, sign up for the NSC Notebook at nosmallendeavor.com.
Hi, friends. It's Annie F. Downs here, and I am so beyond excited to share with you that I have a brand new TV show called I Gotta Ask that begins airing Thursday, May 28th on The Wonder Project, which you can find through your Amazon Prime Video app. You may have heard of The Wonder Project because they're the ones who brought you The House of David, and I am so honored and honestly have zero chill that I get to partner with them to make this dream come true. I love how Wonder Project is not only creating great original TV and movies that audiences can experience together, but also curating content via their subscription on Prime Video filled with meaningful stories. The first 2 episodes of my talk show, I Gotta Ask, premiere on May 28th, followed by 2 episodes each on June 4th and June 11th. In every episode, I sit down with a group of friends, some experts in their fields and some thought leaders, some just my real life people. And we talk about things like, why is dating so hard in 2026? Or how do I build a business? What do I do with fear and anxiety? And so many more questions that I just had to ask. I cannot wait to hear what you think. You can subscribe today at igottaask.com.
You know, I'm really passionate about making decisions that align with your faith and your values, especially when it comes to your family. And one area where that can feel really challenging right now is healthcare. Costs keep rising, and it's hard to feel confident that you're choosing the right path. That's why I wanted to share something I've been learning about called Liberty Health Share. It's not health insurance. It's a healthcare sharing ministry, which means you're joining a community of believers who come together to help carry one another's medical expenses. It's people living out the idea that we're stronger when we support each other and show up for one another. They offer programs for different stages of life and different budgets. So whether you're newly married, starting a family, or just looking for a better, more aligned approach, it's worth checking out. If you've been praying about a better way to navigate healthcare, this could be something to look into. You can learn more at libertyhealthshare.org. That's libertyhealthshare.org. Liberty HealthShare, a force for good.
Norman Wirzba, welcome to No Small Endeavor.
Yeah, great to be with you, Lee.
Lovely to have you with us, and grateful. I've been looking forward to conversation with you for a long time, so glad we get to visit today.
Oh, good.
So you are a farm boy become a theologian, and
Right.
I would suspect that you might think of that description not necessarily in terms of discontinuity, but continuity. That there's something about you being a farm boy that's made it possible for you to do things as a theologian you could not have done otherwise. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that is fair to say. I would also say I didn't come to it by myself. It was really getting to know some other people who really helped me understand that, first of all, Scripture is an agrarian book. And I had never thought of it, even though I grew up with farm folks. And the person who helped me see that was Wendell Berry. And so that put me on this trajectory, which was on the one hand, it was a way for me to reclaim some of my past, which was a really wonderful gift because it meant I could be more integrated as a person whenever I did theological or philosophical work. So that on the one hand helped me integrate my own personal interest and experience, but it also put me on a path that I think was a little bit different because so much of the way theologians and philosophers have thought about things has been from an urban point of view. So yeah, it's been a wonderful, wonderful gift.
When you think back about days as a farm boy, what are lovely visions or smells or memories that arise for you?
Oh, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I grew up in Southern Alberta, and so the Rockies were my western horizon.
Wow.
And it could be very windy, but the wind often carried the smell of sweetgrass, and the smell of freshly cut hay is just still something that just transports me back to big skies and fresh air. And, but also we had pigs and cattle, and the birth of little pigs is just a marvelous thing. Or if you have a calf that you can actually play with, and of course, until they get bigger and then they'll knock you flying. But, it was just a wonderful time to be outside so much of the time and know that the place that you were in was just brimming with life. And that's a wonderful thing.
Large family, small family?
Yeah, I was the fourth of four kids, and my parents were, obviously the ones who were running the operation with my older brother. But then a grandfather, who was my mom's dad, was at our place almost every day, and probably the most important influence on my formation as a youngster, because he was one of these people who had a kind of uncommon attentiveness to where he was, and really was so gentle with the life that he took care of. And that made a deep, deep impression on me, so much so that I remember I was supposed to start grade 1, and I refused to leave the farm and go to school. I didn't want to do it because at that point it was my grandfather's farm. We ended up getting our own family farm a few years later. And I just refused. And so I missed the first week of school because I just preferred to be with my grandfather than be in a classroom.
When you say that he was gentle with all of the life he took care of, what's a picture of that, or what does that look like?
Oh, yeah. So, one of the things that you do when you have cattle is, and you have them in corral systems, is, you really have to make sure that they have water and feed, but also bedding, right? Because that meant you put a lot of straw bales out into the corrals. And there was never an occasion where he would get angry with the animals that he was taking care of, even when the animals could be rather, rebellious, even, cantankerous, and they could hurt you. But he would never lash out at the animals. And I remember one time as a kid, playing with, kittens and stuff like that. And he would always say, don't ever abuse these animals. Make sure you're always gentle with them. And for a boy, that's a tricky thing because boys, you can do stupid things. And he would always want to make sure that we were never aggressive or violent with animals. He said, these are animals that are taking care of our family, and we have to treat them with respect. And, just an example of the way he thought about the animals in his care. We had chickens, and, we had a bunch that we would raise for food, broilers, but we also had egg laying. hens that we would keep, about 25 or so. And they could go anywhere on the farm that they wanted to. But in the summer months in particular, after lunch, he would often grab a scythe and a bucket, and he would go find some grass, 6 feet tall or 6 inches tall or whatever, and mow it down. And this is really fresh grass. And so it's just something the chickens would love. And he would walk to the chickens, and they would come running to him. He would throw the grass, and the chickens would jump in the air to catch the grass. And it was a totally unnecessary thing to do, because these chickens could go anywhere they wanted on the farm, get their own grass, right? But he figured this made his chickens happy. So he said, I got to take care of them, because if they're going to feed me, I want to make sure that their life is a good life. And so that little ritual, it still sticks in my mind all these years later, because A, it was so unnecessary, and B, it was an indication of his kindness, but also his understanding that a farm can be a place of shared joy, not just for people, but even with the animals. And that's an amazing thing, because you look at chicken farms now, there ain't much of that happening.
Yeah, that's just a beautiful picture. So when you think about, I mean, you've talked about that gentleness and that facilitation of delight or joy even for chickens.
Yeah.
What would you think of other prominent virtues or habits or ways of seeing the world that you learned as a farm boy?
Yeah, I think a big one, which, I've taken a lot of years to almost unlearn, not being farming myself. But, one of the things that you have to be able to exercise is a kind of patience. Because when you're dealing with living creatures, plants and animals, they have their own rhythms, their own routines. And sometimes it's something you don't want to have to deal with, right? Because you have things that you'd like to do according to your schedule. And I think one of the things growing up that was really difficult for me to manage at that time in particular was that my city friends, they could wake up in the morning and say, what do I want to do? But when you wake up on a farm, it's what do the plants need? And so, they have to be irrigated if you're living in an arid climate like Southern Alberta is. And that meant getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning to change irrigation pipes, and then doing that 2 more times during the day. Wow. And you're doing that while you're getting mosquitoes that are just attacking you as you're out in that, green, wet climate. And so that kind of thing requires you to put yourself aside and what you want aside. And that's a thing that is hard for a young person to navigate, I think, as you get older. And again, you see adults who have been farming for a long time, and this is just part of the way that they live. There's a kind of sense that the world shouldn't exist on our terms, but that we need to figure out how to put ourselves in their terms. And that requires a kind of patience, a kind of gentleness, and a kind of mercy. And the whole project of industrialization is a way to overcome that, because now what industrialized farming does is it says we're going to try to make animals and plants live according to a schedule that we set. And I saw up close how that can be pretty destructive of the life that you're trying to take care of.
Well, that's a very helpful segue into your book, This Sacred Life. And you ask in that book 3 interweaving questions. Where are you? Who are you? How should you live? So I'd love to first start exploring a little bit more. Where are you? And you begin, I think, chapter 1 talking about the predominance of the notion of the Anthropocene. Right. So would you kind of describe for us what the significance of that construct and what it is and how what it helps us see?
Yeah, sure. I guess the best way to start is to say that for about 10,000 years, we've been living in this period called the Holocene. And that's this period in which there was a kind of regularity, predictability to natural cycles. I mean, things could get rather unpredictable, as anyone who's lived in the natural world knows. But this was so important because it's within this 10,000-year window that human beings could develop agriculture. And that's so important because agriculture has been the bedrock of civilizations for thousands of years, because it's where we got food. It's where we learned how to, develop fiber and forestry and so forth. And so the predictability of climate was really, really important for that civilizational development. But, geomorphologists and natural earth system scientists said that around the year 2000 or so, we began to question whether or not something like nature's predictability could be assumed any longer, because what had happened is that we had been putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we were destabilizing the system's predictability, because what all that CO2 does when you put it in the atmosphere, it acts like a kind of blanket. Or if you're thinking about a car, when you're in a car and the windows are closed and you don't have air conditioning going on, if there's sunlight coming into the car will just heat up on the inside because the heat can't escape. And we were doing that with the whole atmosphere. And so Earth system scientists started to say, well, since the Industrial Revolution, at least, we have been putting so much CO2 in the air because of the fossil fuel combustion that we're doing to run our cars, run our industries, and so forth. And that has now created this destabilizing effect. And weather is the great way to see this, but there are other ways as well, right? Acidity in the ocean, sea level rise, melt of glaciers and snowpacks. But one of the things it's really done is it's made weather systems much, much less predictable, so that things like an early frost or a late frost are very hard to understand or predict, or things like the kind of rainfall that we get, the gentle rains that people had expected, or in certain cultures where the rainy season is crucial to their food production, those things have become really unstable. And so we're now in this world where we are, through our industrial economic activity, changing in fundamental ways Earth systems. There's another side to it too, which would be biological systems because of genetic engineering. We have obviously done genetic manipulation of plants and animals for some time. We've used a lot of poisons to try to control the kinds of weeds that we don't want to have in our fields. And these toxins are working their way into the tissues of living creatures. And the question is now, what is a human being when so much of its food contains all these elements that are affecting physiological function? And when you think about the prospect that we can engineer, cells and organisms, is it reasonable to say that we live within nature, or that we are the bosses of nature, right? And that's why it's called the Anthropocene, because it's the Greek word anthropos, which is human, and it means that we're in the era of the human, because whatever human beings decide to do, and obviously the deciding is not being done by everybody, what human beings decide to do is going to shape the future of all life on this planet. And that's a new thing, right? Historically, people have been dwarfed by the power of nature. Now nature has to deal with the fact that human beings are affecting its systems at the most levels.
You said there that, as kind of an aside, it's not all humans. And in the book, you use the language that I think you pick up from somebody else of maybe, as opposed to Anthropocene, maybe Capitalocene. Maybe unpack that for us.
Yeah. I mean, this is where history gets very, very important. When we think about the fact that for so many people, they've been peasants or they've been villagers, and they have very little power. The scope of their activity is really limited to their immediate vicinity. But then when you get the development of industrialization, and we look to 19th century England as the place where this really takes off, right? We get Isaac Watt, who develops the steam engine, and that puts in place a whole factory system that now runs not on water, that runs not on sunshine and muscle power, it runs on machine power, right? That's a major innovation. And who decided that, right? It wasn't decided by most people. In fact, what we learn when you pay attention to the history is that industrialized methods of production required concentration of people in cities. It meant, the world that Charles Dickens describes, where you have children working in factories, going into mines to do this work. And there's a lot of coercion and there's a lot of violence involved in that shift in the way people navigate their daily lives. So they didn't have a choice in this, but there were certainly business and political elites who saw that it was tremendously to their advantage to put in a system in which, the kind of wealth that can be generated through industrial systems is enormous. And so the capitalist system, right, and I'll back that up in a minute, but the capitalist system that we see going off in industrialized worlds is not being democratically decided. It's not being democratically governed. And so you have to say that not everybody decided that they want to have this industrialized world. Now, I said we should back it up because before you have industrialized capitalism, you have mercantile capitalism. And that's so important because what this way of thinking about the world did is it fundamentally changed how we thought about land, right? Think about how settlers, when they came to these indigenous communities and claimed them as property, the people and the land, right? This is a completely new way of thinking about Earth and about fellow creatures, that all of these living beings, and land is a living being, to think that you could make it private property is a completely new innovation in the way people thought about their relationships to land and to fellow creatures. And so that transformation in what we think the world is so important for putting in place then a whole new economy, political systems that all depend upon private property, the securing of it, the profiteering from it, right? That becomes the bedrock of modern cultures. And that's, again, something that a lot of people have not had a say in.
I think it was in your book that I saw that you said that something like 90 corporations. Help me with what it was.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of wealth consolidation is really staggering. And, I think even if you think about the current environment that we're in, the top 0.1% of the population, control something like 50% of the wealth of the world. Now that's just a staggering figure to contemplate. How is it that just a small number of people, we call them billionaires now, have so much control of the wealth of this country? And what kinds of problems is it creating when you have that kind of wealth inequality, right? Thomas Piketty's talked about this in his writing about what wealth inequality is doing to our societies, the kinds of resentments it's causing, but also how the wealth inequality is creating a class of people who are mostly oblivious to the damage that they are doing through their economic policies because they are able to insulate themselves from it, right? So the fact that you've got people who live in gated communities where they have really no understanding about the effects of their economic policies or their political policies, what those effects are for people on the ground. I think one of the real striking examples of this was a few years ago when Pope Francis released the encyclical Laudato Si. I remember a reporter asked me, do you find it offensive that the encyclical says that industrialized systems are treating the world as a garbage dump? And I said, I don't think it's inappropriate at all because Pope Francis comes from the global south, Argentina in particular. And so people who live in these poorer communities, they see the effects of the wealth generation that's happening primarily in the global north. And because these are people who can shield themselves, right? And I'm part of that class. I mean, I live in a place where I don't have to see toxic dumps. But if you live in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, you're seeing that the cost of fossil fuels is reflected in cancer rates, in water pollution, in property values that have plummeted because they are now on toxic sites and things of this sort. So we're doing a kind of wealth inequality, or we're condoning a kind of wealth inequality, which is creating two classes of people, those who are insulated from the effects of what they do, and then the very large number of people who have to live with the effects of the dominant economy.
So you place the rise of transhumanism within this context, that when one sees the so-called environment as something to be used or manipulated, property to be used or manipulated, people to be used or manipulated, that in time you get transhumanism. So
Yeah.
For those who can't see how you get from A to B,
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah. I mean, it connects a little bit to what we started talking about, right? Where you're living with animals and with plants, and you realize that you have to live on their schedule, right? To meet their needs. Because if you don't take care of their needs, your own needs are not going to be met. Okay. That's sort of the basic rule for life with plants and animals, right? Nurture the places that nurture you. That nurture, as I said, requires us to be patient. It requires us to be servants of those that we take care of. And that means you have to give up control. And that's something that is very difficult for a lot of people to handle, right? We want to be the ones in control. We want to be the ones that set the terms for our own life. And that means you have to take control of others. And so we've done that by taking control of land, right? Putting it in the terms of property that we can, assign various financial values to. We do this with agricultural products. We do it with animals. We do it with workers, right? People think of other people as units of production or units of consumption. But eventually, this has to turn to ourselves, our own bodies, because to be in a body and not just have a body, right? We are our bodies. You then have to deal with the fact that our bodies, they fall apart. They don't always do what we want them to. And we don't like that. And so transhumanists, part of what they will be doing is they will be trying to figure out how do we bring our bodies under a kind of regimen in which we can stave off illness, where we can even solve death, as a division of Google is talking about. The idea that we could engineer our human bodies so that we don't have to deal with, limitations, right? The Transhumanist Manifesto that was put out a few years ago by Max Moore and some other people, right? They were arguing that nature has disappointed us because we are frail, we are finite, we dysfunction as well as function. And so the idea that we could make a world susceptible to all of our control would eventually have to land where we try to make our own bodies susceptible to our control. And so we get visions of engineering the human being so that we can live forever, right? Ray Kurzweil, one of the founding figures in the transhumanist movement, he longs for the day where all of the physical infirmities that he deals with are solved. And that's a very strange way, I think, of looking at a human being, that we are a problem to be solved. I think the much better way for us to think about ourselves is to say that we're a mystery that we're supposed to cherish and take care of and honor and celebrate. I mean, that's the important thing to be doing. But as soon as you say cherish a frail body, that means you have to deal with the frailty. And do we want to do that? Not so much.
The one other obvious, I think, big category that relates to all of this is just the notion of a frictionless life.
Yeah.
And our pursuits of ease. And what do you see that doing to us? What do you see it robbing us of?
Yeah, that's a really important question. The way I put it with people is that if you think that the world should exist on your terms, and the minute it doesn't, we can check out, or that to make the world on our own terms, we have to exercise very strong control mechanisms to make it do what we want to be done. We know that there's something wrong with that the minute we translate that to the level of interpersonal relationships, right? So imagine somebody says, I will be a friend to you, but I will only be your friend as long as you don't cause me problems, right? That the minute that happens, you're going to say, well, that's not a friendship. But that's the reality of a human being's life, right? We can be beautiful, we can be wise and witty, but we can also be really difficult and complex and a bother to other people. And so to think that we should have relationships that are governed by control and ease, or the friction-free future that Silicon Valley wants to promote, it just breaks down immediately when you translate it to interpersonal relationships. I mean, I would hope that someone who decides and agrees to be my friend will stick with me when I can be difficult. Because if we're honest, we know that we are all difficult, that we can be, beautiful, but we can also be really stupid in the things that we do. And so even something as basic as forgiveness is just crucial to our life with each other. But one way to talk about the modern economy and industrial technoculture is that we don't want to have any forgiveness ever required, because it's just smooth sailing all the time. And everything we decide has always been the right thing to decide.
On climate change, I think one could assume from what you've described for us so far that climate change is not merely a scientific problem, but maybe a moral and social one as well.
Right. Yeah. I think that's really important to say, because the world that we have, in which climate change has become such an all-encompassing and vexing issue, is a world that didn't just happen, right? Choices have been made that really drive economies that are creating the very problems that we're dealing with. And if we don't talk about the choices that are being made by decision makers, political, economic leaders, and so forth, if we don't talk about those, we're going to assume that we can just keep going and things will somehow, who knows how, just get better. And that's a delusion. We know what some of the sort of mechanical or geophysical drivers are of climate change. We know about CO2. We know about methane. We know about sea level rise. We know about how all these things are working in the mechanics of their working. But we're not talking about the kinds of cultural transformation that are going to be required for us to prevent these kinds of things. And I think most people would agree that we're now past the stage of preventing. We've already gone 1.5 degrees Celsius past pre-industrial levels. So really what we're at now is this stage where we have to figure out how are we going to do the adaptation in various communities. And, some of them are going to have to adapt in ways that others are not. So for instance, in North Carolina, where I live, coastal people are already thinking seriously about how long they're going to be able to stay in their communities, because when hurricanes come through, as they will, these communities are facing tremendous flooding. And how many times can you rebuild after a flood? And we need to, be serious about thinking, how do people who are living in these communities, how do they handle something like migration, which is a big deal, right? If you've grown up in a place and you think this is your home, and suddenly you have to leave because you can't stay there. You just physically cannot stay there. It's not safe. You can't have the kind of infrastructure you need to maintain a human life there. Right? We're going to have to think about, how do we help communities deal with this? How do we help families deal with the fact that the places that they have called home have been ruined by human activity, right? This is a serious issue. And what I want to sort of, emphasize is that while we are facing this difficult future, we can still create moments and places where beauty and goodness can thrive. But we have to do this with a kind of clear vision about what's required of us, how we need to change not just our economies and our built environments, but we have to change ourselves in terms of what our expectations are. Because the expectations, I think, that we've been encouraged to have shown themselves not just to be unrealistic, but they've also shown themselves to be deeply damaging to communities and to ourselves. And how do we talk about that? I don't know that there are many places we can do that outside of educational institutions, religious institutions, because presumably, hopefully, those will be the places where questions about values, not just moral, but also aesthetic values, can still be talked about.
How would you respond to someone who says you're just being pessimistic? You're lacking optimism. That you're not taking seriously the human capacity to use technology to solve our problems.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think one of the reasons I don't like techno-optimism is that it assumes that there's a kind of savior. Call him Elon Musk, for instance. He's going to come up with that gizmo that's going to get us energy that costs nothing. to the environment, costs nothing to us personally. But I think the history of technological development, and I'll be the first to say there's a lot of technological development that I applaud. And I want to say we don't want to go back. I mean, who wants to go back to an era before antibiotics, for instance, or the kinds of sanitation systems that we have, and, heating and cooling in homes, right? Those are wonderful things that we can applaud. But I think we also have to be very clear-eyed about how so much technological boosterism is marked by this singular inability to subtract, right? It's only the positive things that get mentioned and never the negative side effects, which invariably are unforeseen, and then they come as a kind of shock. And I think the fact is that now we're living in a world where, if in previous times people could do things and they would have bad side effects and we could waste a place and move somewhere else, we're at full capacity on Earth right now. There aren't places that we can go to where things are all pristine and start again. We're going to have to learn to figure out how do we work with technological systems that do good things, but can also do some pretty bad things, and learn to factor in that subtraction, right? What are the costs associated with our desire to have artificial intelligence, for instance? When you think about data centers, when you think about the numbers of people who are putting in data who are not getting paid a living wage, or you're thinking about the cobalt mines in the Congo where people are living lives of misery so that we can have the chips that we need and the batteries that we need to run all of our techno devices. We need to expand the scale of our vision and think about how are we doing accounting that is more honest, that is more encompassing of the good and the bad. And when we do that, I think we can get into a position where we can start to say the costs of some developments are simply too high. And that's a difficult choice to make, because we will need community support to say, there is this possible benefit associated with this technology, but maybe the cost is too high.
Hey, friends, one of the things that we've learned from listeners is that many of you don't want to just listen to these conversations. You'd like to go deeper than that. That's part of why we created NSC Plus, which is our subscriber community, where we share additional conversations, reflections, and bonus material connected to the themes of the show, especially looking for ways that this can relate to the practice of your own life. Recently, we started a new series called Reflections on a Good Life, in which I share brief reflections arising from some of our favorite NSC interviews. You might think of it as a weekly 7-minute episode in which I pull out some pearl of wisdom from an interview and suggest a question on which you might choose to meditate to further cultivate some goodness in your own life. We've also launched a new bonus series called Books You Should Know. In the first installment, I sat down with Dr. Lee Warren for a conversation that quickly became one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. It's all waiting for you over at NSC Plus. And just as importantly, NSC Plus is what helps keep No Small Endeavor on the air and available for free to everyone. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and if these conversations have been meaningful to you, we would truly love to have you join us. You can learn more at nosmallendeavor.com or click the link in the show notes and join NSC Plus. Starting something new is hard and honestly can be terrifying. When we started No Small Endeavor, there were plenty of what ifs. What if no one listens? What if it doesn't work? But sometimes the thing worth doing is precisely the thing that requires you to take a leap. And if you're starting a business, Shopify helps make that leap a little less daunting. Shopify, the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand style. And you can also get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you with email and social media campaigns. If you get stuck, Shopify is always around to share advice with their award-winning 24/7 customer support. It's time to turn those what ifs into with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/NSC. Go to shopify.com/NSC. That's shopify.com/NSE.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Yeah, it's interesting that you revert to accounting there, especially given that I think so much of the popular rhetoric around these kinds of conversations is that those who speak on behalf of or with regard to we'll use the problematic word environment or the theological word creation, those who speak on behalf of such entities or realities are oftentimes typified as being anti-human, and maybe in some cases they might be, but are regarded as anti-human and or even anti-business. And yet there you are referring to, obviously, as we'll talk to you in just a moment, you're very pro-human, right. But there you are appealing to a business construct as crucial here. So I don't know, any commentary you want to make about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something, I come out of the humanities. Philosophy and theology are the languages that I work in most of the time. And, we can be notorious for just being anti-whatever and anti-capitalist or anti-business. And that's just silly because we are economic beings, right? We are ecological beings, but we're also economic beings, which means we live by the exchange of the things that we need from each other, right? I've never been self-sufficient. And nobody is self-sufficient, right? I mean, maybe very few people could pull it off, but for the most part, we depend on each other and we depend upon the use of a world. And in our use of each other and of the world, we need to make sure we're doing justice by how we use, what we use, how much we use. And that's accounting. And I think what troubles me about some of the various forms of accounting that we see now, like, fundamentalist free market ideologues, they will not count a lot of things in their calculations because either they don't think they matter or they're just oblivious to those costs, right? And so when I talked about the cell phone a second ago, right, to run that cell phone, we need lithium batteries, we need all sorts of heavy metals, and we need all kinds of minerals. We don't see the mining sites. We don't see the communities that are devastated. We don't see the illness of people. And because we don't see it, we don't count it. And so the true cost of a cell phone is not reflected. I mean, I've been arguing about this with food for a very, very long time, right? The cost of food right now, I know it's gone up recently, but, the cost of food does not reflect ecological cost. It does not reflect the cost to farmers because, many of them are living on the margins because there is such a small profit margin for people who grow real food, right? And so we're talking about rural communities that have just become ghettos all across this country. And why are we not factoring any of those things? Soil infertility, water wasting, poisoning of our fields, right? These are not things that show up in the relatively cheap price of food in a grocery store. So again, it's an issue of not seeing and not accounting for the full costs of the activities and the choices that we make.
When you talk about being a human, you will speak of the ways in which we must pay much more attention to the interdependent nature, as you were just saying, and even use this language of a meshwork world.
Right.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So one of the ways to talk about our sort of cultural moment is to say that we're in the grip of a neoliberalist way of thinking. And neoliberalism, as many people would experience it, is this idea of individualism. It's self-reliance, it's self-making. You set the terms for your life. And the novelist Ayn Rand was really the popularizer of this in this country. And, her stuff is not what I would call philosophically very noteworthy, but she is noteworthy because so many politicians and people in positions of business and economic power, they love her because she sort of praises the self-made, man often, but any self-made individual who doesn't depend upon anybody else. So that if you succeed, it's all, you're good. And if you fail, it's all your fault. And it's reflected in the suspicion of social programs. It's reflected in, our reliance on the automobile, right? Independent choice, go wherever you want, whenever you want, on your own terms. And anything that would suggest the common well-being is cast as sort of socialist or even communist, right? It's a reflection of how we think of ourselves as single, unitary, self-driving, self-legislating beings. And what I want to say is, from any sort of physiological point of view, that's simply false, and it's reflected every time you eat. Now, you can't live out of yourself. You have to live by consuming the life of others. And the minute you start to acknowledge the physiological dependence that we have on other creatures, and you start to then reflect about, well, what about social dependence on others? And you start to realize, I could not be who I am apart from parents, apart from teachers, apart from friends, apart from coworkers, all of whom have invested in me and have made it possible for me to do the things that I do. I mean, even something as simple as speaking a language already reflects your need of others, because languages are social things, or just our thinking about how our very basic thoughts have never been our own, right? When I speak, I hear the voices of my grandfather, and the voices of novelists that I've read, and the voices of preachers I've heard, and the voice that they're all in my mind, not always in conscious ways, obviously, but it's this reflection that, we might speak in the active voice, right? Subject reflecting upon an object world out there. But we live in the middle voice, which means that every time I speak, others are speaking through me. Every time I move my body, the bodies of other creatures are moving through me because I ate them. And if I didn't eat them, I couldn't even move, right? So this idea that we are self-contained, self-determining beings that are individual is physiologically false. And it's also personally and socially false, because for us to exist, others have to be existing through me at the same time.
Yeah, for whatever reason, it seems like I've just stumbled here recently upon, earlier just this week, an interview with Lindley Dixon, who's a farmer and helped start the Real Organic program, and talking about even the way that trees communicate with one another and are connected with one another. And reading in this Sacred Life, the way in which the microbial life, we're inseparable from microbial life, and that even our own evolution is dependent upon such, and just the interrelated nature of all things continues to impress itself upon me. And that desire to be the individual it's such a deeply embedded idolatry in us, or a deeply embedded conceit in us that's it's hard for us perhaps to disentangle ourselves from.
Yeah, and I think historically it's fascinating to see how when Darwin, proposed this idea that human beings and all creatures evolve in terms of their relationships within ecological niches, but also in terms of all sorts of metabolic relationships that are just crucial for the development of any living organism. That made people angry because it seemed to diminish our specialness, right? That we are the species that are so distinct from everything else. And, in the religious tradition, that got put as we are made in the image of God, nothing else is. And so you get a kind of human exceptionalism. And Darwin seemed to threaten that. And that made people really angry. It didn't matter that it's actually true that we are all living within evolutionary processes of co-development. But then the second big one that's come along in more recent years is what we might call the microbiome revolution, in which we now understand that most of the life that we thought was ourselves isn't ourselves, because our bodies are hosts to billions of microorganisms that live throughout our bodies, mostly in our gut. But these microscopic creatures of bewildering variety, we've barely begun to understand what they are, who they are, how many kinds there are. If we didn't have them in our bodies, we wouldn't be able to digest food. We wouldn't be able to develop immune systems that can fend off disease, right? So the thing that I like to tell people is that you are never a single you. You are, in fact, a zoo of life living inside. And when you think about yourself that way, you think, oh my, that's again a diminishment of our humanity, because I thought I was self-secure in myself, but we're not, right? We're always depending upon life. And to think that without these microscopic creatures, I would die, that can be really humiliating if you're committed to human exceptionalism. But if you're committed to the understanding that we are always a shared life with others, it's a beautiful thing, because it stitches us more intimately into a living world. And once you understand how you are stitched into this living world, it might be a little bit of an inspiration to say, maybe we should take care of the microbiome that's in the soil so that the microbiome that's in our guts can both be healthy. Because when they're both healthy, we're going to have a much better life.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, that seems to be an extension of what you learned from your grandfather.
It is, yeah.
The happiness with the chickens. And I was not raised on a farm, and I didn't hunt much, but I did annually. We would go dove hunting, and I remember the first time I went dove hunting, and I remember we shot a bird, and my father taught me how to wring its neck, and I remember the warmth of the blood running across the back of my hand, across the top of my fingers. And the first time I'd ever had that experience. And I've always looked back on that with gratitude, because I think one of the things that it taught me was that we live by the sacrifice of other living creatures and other living entities. And it made it so real to me, and it's a very different kind of posture, I think, that I just got in that one little glimpse, that you're pointing us to this sort of, gratitude, and joy in our interdependence that gets so obscured by our consumerist world.
I think you're right about that. And, to bring it back to my grandfather, I think that is at root what prompted gentleness in his own demeanor toward other living things, because he knew that if you're going to eat a chicken, you're going to take its life. And that's a very sacred moment. If you don't treat the chicken as just a mechanism, right? If you see it as a living being that is feeding you so that you can live, we have an obligation to respect the life and to care for that life. The hallmark of the sort of sacrifice that you mentioned is, there's always the question, why in cultures around the world is the animal that is sacrificed only ever a domesticated animal, right? Wild animals are never sacrificed in religious traditions around the world. And one of the best explanations, I think, that has come up for this way of living with creatures where you sacrifice them is that there are two offerings that happen at the sacrificial altar. One is the offering of the animal, yes. But the other thing that you're offering is yourself. And if you're not offering yourself through the care that you show to the animal that you sacrifice, your sacrifice is illegitimate. And that's why I think when you look at the Israelite prophets, they denounce sacrifice, because what's happening in Israel at this time is that people are showing up at the temple and they're just buying animals and they're putting them at the altar. And the priests are saying, but there's no life of self-offering. You've done nothing to care for this animal. And the way we know that you've done nothing to care for this animal is that you have an uncaring disposition. And that uncaring disposition is reflected in what the prophets denounce, which is the fact that there are orphans, there are widows who are not being taken care of, right? So the whole sacrificial sensibility is dependent upon the people who offer sacrifice having cared for what they are sacrificing. And this is why I think the language of sacrifice has become so troublesome, is that we see in our cultures the language of sacrifice being used to oppress people or to diminish other creatures, right? When we make, say, the woman sacrifice her life for the good of the man, or when we send young people into war and say, you're making a sacrifice for this country, but the war is not a just war. I mean, we can see how sacrifice can be misused and distorted by taking out the self-offering care that is always the prerequisite for a legitimate offer.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about in the quest for the frictionless life, we lack the formation that can make us caring people, right? Because if it's all up to what's capable to me as a consumerist being, then I never have that kind of cultivation of self where I become the person who cares for others or cares for myself or cares for the world around me.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about how when you live in a world where you manage your existence, you're taking care of your livelihood through just shopping for things, you never really have to figure out, well, what was the care that went into the making of these things? Right. And I think that's a real signature issue for me now is we're in a world that is awash with things that we can purchase. But are we learning to cherish any of the things that we buy? And the fact is that they're not often cherished because we're so content to throw them away and get the new and improved version. But if we understood how the things that we have and use reflect cherishing in their making, would we be so quick to throw them away? Would we be so quick to abuse the things or neglect the things that we have? So the ability to care, I think, is absolutely foundational to us being able to live better with each other, but also to live better with our world, to live better in our neighborhoods, to live better in our homes, to live better with any of the things that we use in the day-to-day.
You adopt or seemingly sympathetically nod to indigenous religious, if we want to use that language, indigenous religious traditions, which might be surprising to someone as a Christian theologian. So how do you see that? And you explicitly set that against Western traditions. So how do you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated because on the one hand, it's dangerous for, Western white guy like me to just go and sort of ransack indigenous cultures and wisdoms because it's exotic or we think it can solve all of our problems and have really no connection with the lives of these indigenous communities. And so I really think it's important for people who want to engage with indigenous peoples that they do this in postures of respect and have gotten consent from the people that they want to learn from. Because just as imperialist colonists took over indigenous lands, now we're trying to take over their knowledge. And I think, one of the things I would say is that it's not just indigenous traditions that interest me. It's also pre-modern traditional agricultural traditions. Because the kinds of cultures that I'm talking about, indigenous cultures, they farmed just as much as they hunted and foraged. And just as pre-traditional agricultural communities, they hunted and foraged as much as they did agriculture. The point that's the important one is how do you find and work with traditions that have spent, generations, hundreds of years actually, navigating their place in the world by learning the practices of care, the practices of attention. And, I just remember talking once with Robin Kimmerer about this, her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, this fabulous book. So many people have read it. And, she talks about how the kind of life that she talks about there grows out of respect for the life that you're engaging, right? Learning the wisdom of trees, the beauty and the nurture of wild strawberries, right? These are things that, you don't presume upon, because you should never presume upon the life of another, because every life is a sacred gift. It's not a commodity that you can just appropriate and do with whatever you want, right? This is something that grows out of the lived experience of taking care and being attentive, being watchful, learning practices of restraint, learning the practices of Thanksgiving, right? I mean, think about the Thanksgiving address that so many indigenous cultures have in varying forms. It's a humbling thing for you to take the time to enumerate the gifts of water and soil and seed germination. And when you do that, it changes your posture. Right. An example that I might give, I think a lot of people love pie. How do you get an apple pie? Right? It's an astounding thing to think about, because somebody had to realize that if you take flour and butter and cold water, you can get a flaky crust. And somebody had to think that if you cook some apples in there, or peaches or whatever pie you happen to love, that's an astounding thing. It's a miracle that pie exists in the world. But to do that, you now have to say, okay, I have to be grateful for wheat germination, and that there's an agricultural community that figured out that you can take wheat, grow it, and you can mash it and make a flour. And then someone had to realize that, there's a thing called a cow, that if you take its milk and you beat it up, you get butter. And you have to mix butter with flour, and you have to make sure that the water's cold and not hot when you're making this flaky crust, right? It's a kind of miracle that reflects the kind of devotion that people had along the way to give us this amazing thing called apple pie. Right? And you can do that with anything, right? I mean, do it with pizza, you can do it with whatever your food happens to be. It's because people have, developed the skills of attention and affection, that these skills then enabled them to make a world that otherwise we might just look at and say, kind of interesting, but then transform that world into something beautiful, right? That a tree could become a beautiful sculpture, or it could be a kitchen table, or it can be a baseball bat, or it can be a guitar. Who thought that you could take a tree and make a guitar? It's astounding, right?
Yes. So let's shift there to, as you again gave us a great segue to do so, towards thinking a bit more about, okay, what do we do with all this? What does this mean in more concrete, specific terms? And I want to begin with your opening inscription, and you'll have to help me. We'll edit this out, but it's her name, Eddie Hailesum?
Yeah, Eddie Hailesum.
Eddie Hailesum. So you have an opening inscription in your book that says, "We should be willing to act as a balm for all wounds," from Eddie Hailesum, who, as I understand, was imprisoned in the Holocaust and then was put to death. How do you think of that as, I don't know, I always especially pay attention to people's inscriptions because I think it gives me a snapshot into what they're up to in the whole thing, right?
Right.
And here, this call to act as a balm for all wounds. How do you see us beginning to try to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll bring it back to my grandfather again, because I grew up with him in Western Canada, and obviously he was an immigrant. He had been farming in Central Europe during the war years, before the war years, and so as a generation, like the generation that raised me, were all refugees from that war. They saw what brutality can do to the world. I mean, having read about the experiences of these people who experienced the war, the kind of destruction and devastation is simply beyond my comprehension. Right? It's hard to fathom so much of Europe reduced to rubble, food just simply unavailable, civic order gone, right? And so he understood about what human beings can do when they are desperate, when they become violent. And I think that this prompted him to figure out, or at least think about tremendously, what does gentleness require, so that we live in a world where the people we meet, the land we tend, the creatures we take care of, we do it out of a posture of how utterly precious this life is, and how easy it is for human beings to violate that precious, sacred character of life. Now, the way this translates, I think, for us today is we're going to need kinds of practices, rituals, I might even say, that bring us into the presence of each other so that we can appreciate them as precious. And this is difficult because we live in a culture that is all about optimization. It's all about acceleration. It's about maximization. And the pacing of life is brutalizing, but the pacing of life is also the sort that makes us oblivious to who we are with, where we are, who we ourselves are, right? I mean, how often do people just take the time to reflect upon how amazing it is that you have a friend who will sit with you or eat with you, or that, you have a body that, it needs rhythms where you have rest as well as exertion. And because we've become so oblivious, one of the practices that has become increasingly important to me is the practice of Sabbath. It's one of the greatest gifts the Jews ever gave the world, I think, because the Sabbath is so much more than simply taking a break from the crazy schedules of the week. The Sabbath is about orienting people in the world so that they come to experience themselves and the world they are in as a place of beauty and goodness, and therefore worthy of our delighting. And the way they put this in the scriptures, right, it's in Genesis 1-2, beginning of chapter 2, is they have a description of God resting on that first Sabbath sunrise. And it's an astounding thing, because why would God do that? And the answer that they gave was because resting is the climax of human activity. And by resting, they don't mean stopping activity. They mean resting as being in the world so that you're no longer governed by restlessness, wanting to have more, wanting to do more, wanting to be more. What the Sabbath is saying is that rest means that you are so in the presence of the other that you are with, that delight and absorption are the things that you want to achieve. And they recognize that this is not going to be easy because our schedules are such that we can quickly become damaging in the ways that we live with others. And that's why they said you need to have the Sabbath observed regularly, and you need to do it in community. Because when you're living in an anti-Sabbath culture, like I think the one we're in is, you're not going to be able to say, oh, I'm just going to do Sabbath by myself. You need encouragement. You need people who will help you be accountable. And when you're in that posture of being in the presence of another in such a way as to value and appreciate their goodness, their beauty, their never again to be repeated freshness, you might say. Right? When you're in the presence of people that way, you learn to treat them differently. You learn to appropriate things much more gently. So you're not just grasping everything, but you're holding it in a posture of reception and gratitude and then generosity. Because what you're supposed to do, I think, is as much as possible, understand that our life is a gift, our world is a gift, the creatures we live with are all gifts. And if we can learn to find ways to remind ourselves regularly not to presume upon their life as if they're ours to do with whatever we want, we'll live more gently, we'll live more mercifully, and we'll live, I think, much more in the posture of generosity and compassion.
So I want to do, kind of as we begin to move toward a close, two follow-ups. And the first one is systemic. I mean, clearly, given the things that you've already said today and the things that you've written about, any sort of solution can't be siloed into, say, a religious answer to these problems or a personal answer to these problems. But it's going to have to somehow entail things as mundane as infrastructure or economic policy and so forth. So what would be some of the ways forward with regard to economic policy, infrastructure, related systems that you would wish to see? Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to that question. And, let's start with the economic one. I think we live in what Wendell Berry once called an anonymous economy, not just a global one, but it's anonymous in the sense that the things that we purchase, we have no idea where they came from. We have no idea what the conditions were under which they were produced. And so as far as we know, the things that we're living by have been abused all along the way. We don't know that. Some of the stuff might be beautifully produced, some of it not. And so I think one of the things that's going to be important is, as much as possible, try to get to know the people who produce the things that you consume, the things that you purchase. And that means trying as much as you can to participate in local economies. And, food is a great way to do this. I know that it's going to be a challenge depending on where you live, right? Some people are going to be closer to agricultural people or gardeners or what have you. But even in larger cities, the fact that we've got community gardens, the fact that we're finding ways to bring the lives of farmers closer to the people who buy their food, that's a really good thing, because people need to understand that eating is just the very basic fact about our day-to-day existence. And we need to figure out that, for us to eat, the hard thing to realize is that others have to die. And so we have to think, how do we make ourselves worthy of consuming the life of another creature, taking the life of another creature? So local economies can be ways for us to start to appreciate the things that we use and need. I also think that people becoming more involved in the making of their own things can do a lot to help us appreciate the sort of the fragility, but also the beauty of this world. So, I advise people to try to grow something, right? Don't try to grow a whole garden. It's enormously difficult. You need a lot of discipline and knowledge, and a lot of people don't have it. But if you just try to grow a tomato or spinach or something like that, you begin to understand that the life of another creature requires your attention and respect and your care. And that can slowly start to change your posture about things. Or if you decide that, you want to have a table. Have you ever thought about making your own table? And then beginning to realize, I now need to make choices about wood. I need to have certain skills so that this table doesn't collapse when I put a plate on it. And, you start to understand something about the fabric of this world, and how this fabric is an interwoven thing that can quickly unravel when we become abusive or negligent, right? So that's sort of the economic side of things. The infrastructure side of things, I think, is also very important. And this is also tricky depending on where you live, because, where I am, we don't have a lot of public transportation. I live outside Durham. And so if I want to go anywhere, I pretty much have to drive. And so we become so dependent upon an infrastructure that requires us to be able to move by ourselves, by our own means, to get to wherever we want. And that's affected infrastructure, right? How we design neighborhoods and cities. And, I'm a pretty big fan of, some of the features of new urbanism, where you're trying to have mixed use. So you have communities that live in places where they're within 15 minutes of their shopping, or 15 minutes of their playing or entertainment, or things of this. Christopher Alexander's written about this beautifully in his very famous book called A Pattern Language, in which how we design houses, how we design neighborhoods, how we design, sort of commerce areas, so that there are sidewalks and there are benches and there are public spaces like parks or, quads or things of squares, where you can have the sort of serendipitous chance encounters with other people, so that you can have the sharing of life, so that the kind of loneliness that we see really built into the way we design our roads, the way we design our neighborhoods, even our houses, right? If we could find ways to build our environments so that something like togetherness is a more likely possibility, I think you find that people are a lot happier in those contexts, because we know that the thing that most improves the quality of people's lives is friendships. It's social togetherness, where we don't just feel ourselves alienated and alone, but we feel ourselves part of a larger whole, a part of a community of people that can support us, can nurture us when things get tough, but can also just be fun to be with, right? So the kinds of togetherness that we think are crucial to a well-lived life, our infrastructure will have a lot to say whether that's going to be less or more likely to happen.
So then what does this look like for you? How do you find your own teaching and writing impacting your daily rhythms of life? What are concrete practices, specific things you pursue to kind of cultivate all this?
Yeah, I think, one of the big things that we try to do is a kitchen table where we have people sharing food, right? Meal times are important to me, and the sharing of food with other people is important to me, because there you have this beautiful thing happen where, people come into your kitchen. Sometimes they help you cook. They bring some of their own cooking, and you decide by welcoming them into your home, you're first of all affirming them, saying that it's important that we celebrate you by feeding you food that's good. And then you have the pure pleasure of eating good food with good people. And it's a pleasurable experience. And that's hard to do, because I know we're called the fast food nation, where, we eat on the run, we eat often alone. And anything that we can do to take something as pleasurable, or at least potentially pleasurable, as eating and make that a social event is just fabulous. And I emphasize too, not just the sharing of the food, but the cooking of the food. I like to cook, I like to bake. And one of the things that you learn when you cook and bake is how food can be this overwhelming surprise. And not just, my own cooking. Right? I've got kids and I've got friends that cook, and they bring you a dish and you say, I had no idea this was possible. And it helps you appreciate the world as a place that's miraculous and wonderful. And it's not just this sort of dismal place that we got to get through until the end and then we die. I mean, that's such a depressing way to think about your own life, but also to think about the world that you're in, right? The world that we are in is beautiful. It's delicious, or potentially. Can't eat everything. And we need to find ways to get into that experience and be reminded of it again and again. So that's one of the big ones, for me. But I think another one is trying to build into your schedule times to reflect in a kind of Sabbath way about what is your life, what is important. And one of the things I used to have students do is take a piece of paper and just write down 7 columns, and then break down how much time you're spending each day doing various things, whether it's eating, sleeping, homework, whatever. And when you do that and you tally up that time over the course of a week, and then a month, and then a year, and then over a lifetime, you can discover that you spent 3 years of your life doing utterly stupid things like scrolling TikTok, and you realize, why did I do that? And so, doing the kind of thing where you have regular built-in time to reflect about, well, what's important? And, doing that with other people, those can be really, really important calibrating kinds of events or times that can have you, rethink your priorities, can help you rethink how you schedule your day. I mean, the old-fashioned word for that would be prayer, right? Prayer is coming into the presence of God and asking, how's it going? How am I spending my time? Am I doing it ways that honor the goodness of the life that's been given to us? I think that's part of what a pure heart is about. A pure heart is one that knows how to receive the world gratefully and share it generously.
Talking to Professor Norman Wirzba. Norman, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your good work in the world and all of the ways you provoke us to consider things that we too often ignore, and to our great peril. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Lee. It was great to talk with you.
This episode is brought to you by Prime. What if you had one more chance with the one that got away?
Sam, you came home.
Based on the best-selling novel from Carly Fortune. Every Year After follows childhood friends Sam and Percy as they reunite in the dreamy, nostalgic lakeside town of Barry's Bay.
Love can be hard to find. So if you're lucky enough to find that person, never let go.
A second chance at first love. Every Year After, streaming June 10th, only on Prime.
Do you hear that? Sounds like breakfast is ready. Because Quaker's coming in hot with morning nutrition. 100% whole grain oats and a good source of fiber to fuel the rhythm of your morning and kickstart your day. And that sounds absolutely delicious. Fuel to start whatever's next. Quaker, official sponsor of FIFA World Cup 26.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This Father's Day, when you ship UPS Air at the UPS store, your items arrive on time or your money back, guaranteed at no extra cost. It's like the father of all shipping services. It shows up to the airport way too early, just to play it safe. It's overprotective about all the things that truly matter. And it's always prompt, especially to be with family. Make it your first choice to celebrate your dad. Ship UPS Air with our money-back guarantee, exclusively at the UPS Store U.S. retail locations. Visit the upsstore.com/airshipping for full details. Terms and conditions apply.